Early this month, the administration unveiled a new budget proposal, the FY 2027 presidential budget request for the Space Force, $71.24 billion. That's more than double last year's enacted budget. It's 450% larger than the Space Force's initial budget in FY 20, and it includes investments that would have seemed extraordinary just 5 years ago. $17 billion in classified R&D, $7 billion in new air moving target indicator capability, and a generational commitment to Golden Dome architecture that puts space-based missile defense front and center. The harder question, the one worth an entire episode, is what this request actually means, what it gets right, what it might be missing, and whether the space community and Congress are prepared to see it through. I'm Bill Woolf, and this is Spacepower. I have two guests whose backgrounds make this conversation uniquely valuable. First, Shawn Barnes. Shawn retired from the Air Force in 2013 as a colonel after nearly 3 decades that included commanding space warning and space group level units, serving as chief of space policy on the Joint Staff, and leading the Space Superiority Division at the Pentagon. But his work didn't stop there. As a member of the Senior Executive Service, he went on to serve as the Department of the Air Force's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Space Acquisition and Integration, the Pentagon civilian lead on space acquisition strategy, and most recently, as the department's primary liaison to the House and Senate Appropriations and Budget Committees. That means he spent years walking budget requests just like this one up to Capitol Hill, managing the relationship between what the department needed and what Congress was willing to fund. He literally knows how these conversations go. He's now vice chair of SFA's board of directors and a senior advisor at the Artemis Group. And he just published an op-ed on this budget that is required reading for anyone in the space community. Joining us as well is Brigadier General Damon Feltman, U.S. Air Force retired, President and CEO of the Space Force Association. Damon came to this role after 32 years that included serving as a Deputy Chief Strategy and Resources Officer for the U.S. Space Force, where he oversaw the development of a $30 billion budget, and as the Chief of the Transport Cell at the Space Development Agency, where he was accountable for the $8 billion 450-satellite proliferated LEO program. Between these two, we have the person who built the request and the person who walked it into Congress, sitting in the same room. Shawn, Damon, thanks so much for taking time and looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. Great to be here, Bill.
Damon, it is great to be here and happy to be with friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, let me start with you, Shawn. You spent years as the Department of the Air Force's primary liaison to the Appropriations Committee, walking budget requests at Capitol Hill, managing the relationship between what the department needed and what Congress would fund. When you saw the FY 27 top line, $71.24 billion, more than double the prior year, what was your immediate reaction, and what did you think Congress's reaction would be?
Yeah, so first of all, my immediate reaction was, wow, and about time. So great to see that level of resources and great to see the sort of detail of where those dollars are going. What will Congress think about this? There will be multiple different views. So whenever anybody asks me about, hey, what does Congress think about? I stop them and say, well, there's 535 members of Congress and each one has their own opinion. However, some of the general themes you're going to see people who are going to say, wow, that's empire building. We don't want that empire building. And so we've got concerns about that. There'll be others that'll say, like I did, wow, about time. We really need to be able to put those kinds of dollars there. And then at the professional staff level, you'll have folks that will very seriously look at every single line that's in there and want to understand why there's that level of growth and can that level of growth be executed. That'll be the key pieces that we'll see from Congress.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Shawn. Damon, any additional thoughts?
I think Shawn hit it right on the hit the nail on the head with the wow comment. When I was at headquarters Space Force as the deputy director of the S5, where the Space Force budget is put together. That particular year, the single year budget was about $6 billion. So $30 billion over 5 years. So here we are going from a single year dollar amount of just, we'll call it $10 billion, and now we're at 70 billion top line, that in just a couple of years, that's a remarkable amount of growth in just a short period of time. So it's, to me, it is long past due, and the Space Force, is in need of this infusion of cash and resources.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as you mentioned, you oversaw Space Force budget development from inside the Pentagon. When you see a request of this scale, what do you say and see that someone outside might miss? What's the story behind a number like this?
It's easy to get kind of blown away by the number. Um, this Now, still, we also have to put in context that compared to the other services, the Space Force, even with this budget request, is still very, very small. I think the Space Force is still 3.5 times smaller than the Coast Guard in this proposal, and it is about 13 times smaller than the Marine Corps in this proposal. And I say that number with respect to the number of military members that the budget is requesting. So Space Force is still small despite this number. I think that's probably number one. Number two, I kind of hinted at this just a second ago. Tucked deep in the numbers, it's actually in some appendix documents that are out there. It didn't really make the major headlines. But the Space Force has been advertising for the past few months that it needs to grow the force in addition to growing the number of assets on orbit. And there are documents, there are some numbers tucked inside some of the appendices that that the White House released with its budget documents. And I'll hit those really quickly. Back in 2025, the Space Force was at just under 10,000 active duty members authorized in strength. That grew to 10,600 in 2026. This number takes it to 13,200 if the appendices hold true. And so that is about half of the amount that the Space Force has been advertising that they want. Now, and we'll see what is in the remaining budget documents. Is this 2,500 a ramp into something bigger, or is it a one-time infusion of manpower?
Yeah, perfect. And to both of you, do you think this is a genuine strategic shift in how the administration values the space domain, or are other factors like Golden Dome driving the top line and pulling space along with it?
Yeah, so I was very interested to see that $71 billion are Space Force dollars. They are not Golden Dome dollars. There's an additional pot of money for Golden Dome. There is no doubt that Golden Dome, the space aspects of Golden Dome, are helping to drive a larger budget, but they are not the key driver. See significant increases across the board, really in all different colors of money, in the procurement accounts, in the RDT&E accounts, in the O&M accounts. And so you're seeing it sort of across the board. So in my mind, it's very much a strategic signal that this administration gets it on the importance of space and the importance of the Space Force.
Yeah, I agree, Bill. I think that what this budget clearly says to the nation and to the Department of War, that is, the president fully supports space. He fully supports the Space Force, and believes that the time has come to make the Space Force more in line with the other services. If you remember back to 2019, really what the Space Force was taking the elements of Air Force Space Command and making it the Space Force, and bringing a few bodies from the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps to plus it up a little bit. But now the Space Force has demonstrated its value. It is showing that it is becoming a real service, and so the manpower is coming along with the other dollars that the Space Force says that it needs.
Yeah, thank you. We have this conversation a lot here at SFA, and I think a lot of people just misunderstand how critical the Space Force is to a future space economy. Realizing that when we do talk about the future space economy, it's a whole globe approach. I mean, it's a multi-trillion-dollar prospectus. And so, Shawn, you've sat in rooms with the members of the Appropriations and Budget Committees on behalf of the Department of the Air Force. Did they understand how critical the Space Force is to ensure freedom of action in the domain, to help grow the space economy that we know everyone's going to be a part of?
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the places that's probably least appreciated on the Hill is a deep understanding of that. I don't think that that most folks on the Hill recognize how space is going to drive our economy, like AI is going to drive our economy, in ways that most of us have not been able to imagine, and what the role of the Space Force will be in supporting that broader infrastructure that's going to be out there. In the same way, and we've heard General Saltzman talk about this a little bit, in the same way that a Coast Guard or a Merchant Marine is responsible for one set of things, whereas the U.S. Navy is responsible for ensuring freedom of navigation around the globe. And that is not something that the Space Force is well equipped today to be able to do, to be able to protect that space economy. But the kinds of resources that we're seeing here are pointing us in the right direction to be able to do that.
Damon, you've built budgets that had to survive the appropriations process. If you were back in your old role watching this request move through Congress, which investments would you be most worried about losing and why?
I would be looking in a couple of places that these were historically easy places to for the department to force what was Air Force Space Command when I was over at Air Force Space Command and in early parts of the Space Force. One really easy place to save money, and I use that term loosely, is to push one or two satellites into the next fiscal year. If you're going to launch a satellite, push it into the next fiscal year and push the booster into the next fiscal year. So in the current year, it looks like you're saving money when in reality, all you're doing is just moving the spacecraft a couple months to the right. And you can do that once or twice, and that you can kind of get through that. But over time, what ends up happening is you end up pushing all of this architecture out to the right. And the capability that you need today keeps being one or two more years down the road because you're doing this to save some money in the budget. So I would be concerned for that, looking where the launch numbers that are in this budget and some of the systems that are being funded, that the appetite might not be there, and Congress tries to push the capability off to the right just a couple of years to even out the bubble of money that's in front of them. That's kind of part one. The second piece is the natural bias when looking at this manpower number that is in front of them is, well, what's the Space Force not doing today that it needs to be able to do? You had asked a question to Shawn earlier about staff members and how they do or do not understand what the Space Force really does. And it is still very difficult for people to understand that the structure that we have today was fundamentally put into place for a different era when space was very permissive, very non-hostile. And it was a services-based capability. We were providing signals, providing GPS, providing imagery. And while the Space Force still has to do that, it also has to be able to secure the domain, defend the domain. And to do those things, you need more people who can do not just protect and defend, but protect, defend, and fight kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting you use those terms because that's exactly what General Gagnon's talking about. So if you've not had a chance to watch that podcast interview, I'd invite everyone to take a look at the interview we recently did with Lieutenant General Gagnon, Commander of Combat Forces Command. Shawn, the request mixes discretionary appropriations with mandatory reconciliation spending, an unusual structure that some members are already skeptical of. You've managed DAF's legislative strategy on the Hill. How significant is that structural complication, and what's the argument for keeping it intact versus splitting it?
Yeah, great question, and it is going to be complicated. We live in a very different world with this administration, one that is willing to take alternative approaches to be able to kind of get the funding that it requires. So the benefit of things being funded in a reconciliation bill, what they call mandatory funding, is that those dollars are often going to be available for a few years, and they don't get relitigated year after year. And so that's a positive thing. And so there may be kind of like 3-year, 4-year kinds of dollars that would be out there and not going to question them the next year. The negative is that first of all, just getting a reconciliation bill passed is its own challenge. And if you've paid attention to the politics, I won't go into all the details, but it's a separate thing from appropriations. The appropriators in general don't like reconciliation bills because it takes control out of their hands. They want to see everything work through the normal appropriations process. And I would say in a perfect world, it would be great if we could have that entire 71, point X dollars all be in normal appropriations. But the truth of the matter is you probably can't get that done. So seeing some of that money, particularly some of the money that will support into Golden Dome, be out there over time and be mandatory, I think will be of good benefit. But it's going to be a hard hill to climb. And I think that we do need to pay attention to, if some of that mandatory spending can't be put into place, that we've got to think about how that gets rolled into a future year's appropriations bill.
Thank you. Any comments, Damon?
No, I tell you, the reconciliation process has been referred to by some commentators as a sugar high, a one-time sugar high. And I can see how that perception gets out there, because as Shawn accurately points out, our budgetary processes they're designed a certain way, and having this externality of extra dollars just kind of not going through the normal appropriations process creates a lot of confusion. So the trick is going to be how much money moves eventually from a reconciliation package down to the baseline and becomes normalized dollars. That's going to be the real tell. And it's also going to be a bit of an interesting conversation during the appropriations process this cycle, because the members of Congress know, well, I've got the bill in front of me, but I know I've got another bill kind of coming right behind it. So what's their motivation to support one when the other is coming if they know they don't like something that's in the other, or vice versa? So that, at the end of the day, a lot of politics is about trades and concessions. So what are the trades and concessions going to be to get both of these things through?
Yeah, thank you. Shawn, before your SES roles, you served as Chief of Space Policy on the Joint Staff and led the Space Situational Awareness and C2 Division at Air Force Space Command. Space domain awareness funding more than doubles in this request, from $528 million to $1.37 billion. From where you've sat, is this sufficient to actually meet the standard of domain awareness against what China and Russia are currently fielding?
Yeah, I think it does a really good job of laying the foundation for where we'll need to be in the future. So as we all accept the fact that space is a contested domain, we have to accept the fact that that contestation will continue to evolve, and it will continue to be more and more difficult to deal with, which means that your space domain awareness then also has to increase over time. So there isn't going to be a single set of programs that we say, well, that solves our space domain awareness challenge. That may solve our space domain awareness challenge for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, but it won't solve what we expect that the Chinese in particular, but the Chinese and others will be doing in 10 years or 15 years. And so whenever you're in a contested domain, and now we understand that, we have to be prepared to evolve with that contestation.
Now, let's pivot real quick, because inevitably everyone just goes to, well, it's classified, we can't talk about it. And I understand that. And I think most people who are listening understand that. However, let's just look at the classified R&D budget and how it jumps from $6.56 billion to $17.3 billion, a $10 billion increase in a year. As someone who's managed space superiority programs at the AAP level and walked classified budget lines to Capitol Hill, what does a number like that actually mean in practice? And how do you defend it in front of an appropriation staffer who can't see what's inside it?
Yeah. So the good news is that the appropriation staffers that will actually tell their boss this is good money or that it's not, those people are cleared. And so the folks that are most germane to these decisions are going to be cleared to this. There'll be plenty of folks that are not cleared, and they may be carping about the size of that. But in the end, they frankly don't get a significant vote on that. I think the challenge of a increase of that magnitude will be similar to increases outside of the space superiority budget, which is, can you actually execute that? And that's a very reasonable question to ask, because not all things get solved just by throwing money at them. And so when you see like doubled budgets, then do you have a program office that's prepared to handle that? Is there an industry base that's prepared to be able to actually execute those kinds of dollars? They're very legitimate questions, and they're going to be tough questions that'll be asked of the Space Force staff.
Thank you. Damon, SFA can't publicly advocate for classified programs it can't speak to. From your experience inside Space Force budget structures, how do you approach supporting investment in capabilities that, by definition, you can't discuss on a podcast?
So fortunately for guys like you, me, and Shawn, at one point we had the clearances to see what was going on, at least a few years ago, and knowing how capabilities evolve over time, we can see the unclassified narrative and kind of, I think I see what's going on here. So from a personal standpoint, as the guy who's the CEO of SFA, or you as the one of the board members and Shawn as a board member, we can kind of read between the lines a little bit and understand. So when we speak on a subject, we do carry a degree of authority and experience that hopefully people will pay attention to. So I would kind of say it like that for one. The second thing I would offer is the thing that is being bought might not or might be classified, but the need, we can talk about a lot of things at the unclassified level, and particularly when it comes to threats, and understand that when there's a threat, we do need some way to counter it. You may not need to know the exact way that we're countering it. You just need to know that there's a threat to counter. So I would encourage people that might be suspicious of the number and what we're trying to do, or what the Space Force is trying to do. Pay attention to some of the narratives over the past 6, 9, 12 months from the Space Force. They have done a very good job over the past at least 12 to 18 months of refining the narrative about what the threat really is and how it is growing so fast in the capabilities that our adversaries are out there trying to develop. The majority of Space Force general officers are fantastic at it, but I would say that Chief Master Sergeant Lurch, is fabulous at talking about the threats in an unclassified setting, and so is Combat Forces Command Commander Lieutenant General Greg Gagnon. Those two gentlemen are just fantastic. So go listen to them. That's not to detract from anybody else in the Space Force, but when I want to get something that is easy to digest and understandable in a hurry, those are the two gentlemen I go listen for.
Yeah, perfect. And, before you retired from civil service, you ran the SDA Transport Cell, the $8 billion, 450 satellite proliferated LEO program. This budget includes over $1.5 billion in new PLEO SATCOM procurement. From inside that program, what does that investment actually buy? And is the acquisition approach fast enough?
The thing that's interesting here now, the way I have an understanding of the budget documents right now is that it's using PLEO pretty generically. We need to see the J books behind it, and the J books are the justification documents that are supposed to come out later this month, and it really dissects what that money is really for. But if you just take the title as is, I would say that what this is doing is they're just trying to add clarity to two specific things that the Space Force has been pursuing over the past few years. One is formally referred to as MILNET, and MILNET is the Space Force's vision for a network of communication satellites in space. Sometimes people will attach Starlink or Starshield to MILNET as the militarized versions of those. So, but MILNET is a program that Space Systems Command has had on its mind for a long time. That term has been replaced with Space Data Network. So you can hear MILNET/Space Data Network kind of interchangeably in there. So the Space Force and the Department of War last year did not put any money against Space Development Agency's Tranche 3 transport program. They zeroed out the budget to save money. They were advocating for MILNET/SDN, and the Space Development Agency on its own, they'd been running into some hiccups along the way with getting Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 out the door. To see that Congress added money back in the 2026 appropriations bill. So the final version of the bill for 2026 added, I think, $500 million back to the Tranche 3 program. So where that leaves us now is the money that is in the president's budget right now appears to be the Space Force kind of pushing into the Space Data Network architecture concept a little bit more. And there could be money in there for Space Development Agency's Tranche 3 transport program. So we'll have to see what the J-books come out and say.
Yeah, thank you. Shawn, as a former Pentagon lead on space acquisition strategy, how do you assess the balance between government-owned and commercial SATCOM architecture in this request? And what does the PLEO investment signal to the commercial sector?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I think in general, the Space Force is in a great position to be able to take advantage of a number of different commercial capabilities, whether those are SATCOM or weather or PNT or ISR, right? There's a variety of things of which the commercial world will continue to be able to bring forward that the Space Force needs to be able to take advantage of. In terms of SATCOM, we as a nation have been reliant on commercial SATCOM for quite a while, and we're going to continue to be reliant on commercial SATCOM. I think the way that we're evolving into some of these proliferated LEO constellations, whether that is Starlink or Starshield, or whether it's AWS, or whether it's TSAT, there's a variety of things there that I think are going to make a lot of sense. There will always be a need, however, for either bespoke requirements or bespoke capabilities that need to be satisfied because we have the need to do things that no one else does. For example, we just exfiltrated, a human being off of a mountain in Iran. We didn't do that using commercial comms. We did that in very different ways.
Yeah, thank you. And a very appropriate example of space superiority in action in that specific mission set. Damon, any comments on that?
I do actually love the fact that you use the word space superiority in that scenario setting. So I'm going to take us down just a bit of a rabbit hole for just a second, because last week there was a debate by some pundits about the Space Force claiming that it had space superiority in Iran. And so in whether or not you can claim space superiority against a nation that doesn't really have space capability to begin with and is demonstrably getting some of its data from other sources. But having said all that, the fact that the Space Force was able to create the backbone of prerequisite data and data in action clearly illustrates its ability to integrate with the joint force and to be time dependent and mission dependent when it brings its forces to bear. So I'll backtrack now and get back onto the question that you really asked here. So the commercial architecture. Shawn is absolutely right. The U.S. military uses a tremendous amount of commercial SATCOM in its day-to-day and combat operations. And I don't see that changing in the near future. Actually, it's probably going to it could skew even more with capabilities like Starlink and Starshield and Amazon Leo and some of these other companies out there that are building these proliferated comm architectures. Basically, they're creating the internet in space. So there will be opportunities to add more commercial services for communication purposes to our kit bag. But the fact remains that there is always going to be some unique capabilities that don't scale economically. You may have the technology available economically, but not really at the volume that the service needs. So this is where I think activities like the Space Development Agency have uh, good insight and good opportunities to leverage the bespoke part of the comm architecture, as well as systems command with some of the other things like the NC3 comm mission.
Thank you. Yeah, you talk about the requirement for commercial to be part of the mission set, which we've heard Space Force senior leaders talking about it for years. And nothing probably more critical, I think, than access to space and assured access to space. So let's pivot now real quickly to talk launch services and how that budget more than triples from $1.33 billion to $4.2 billion. The proliferated architecture only works if you can get that satellite into orbit at pace. From your perspective and your experience, Damon, running a major LEO program, what's the real bottleneck? And does this budget address it?
Um, I'll go back to something that Shawn said a moment ago. Sometimes throwing money at a problem doesn't solve the problem. Now, I'll say that you can't solve certain problems without money, and having money in the budget is a very good thing here. I use that as a setup to say these proliferated architectures that the Department of War are pursuing, that the Space Force is pursuing on behalf of the department. One of the risks is the industrial base not having the throughput to make it work. That's one of the observations from Space Development Agency, that there has to be a rich industrial base. That's kind of part one. Part two is on the program management side. Our program managers, at least those of our generation, the folks who are in leadership positions now, they grew up building satellite constellations of single-digit numbers or handfuls of numbers. So learning how to manage a program that has dozens of spacecraft in the production line is different. So I would say that's a place where the service has to be careful with these LEO programs, because when you buy the rockets typically are a long lead item, so you buy them a little bit early. What you don't want is to spend the money and have a rocket finished waiting for you and nothing to make to it. So that is a disconnect in how we do this acquisition process, that we need to get better at synchronizing the rockets availability. Now SpaceX, man, that with their reusability and their launch cadence, we may not need to book those 2 years in advance. It's helpful, but at the same time, it may not be the most efficient use of time or dollars.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
the
Shawn.
NSSL program, National Security Space Launch Program, has really been remarkably successful. We've managed to ensure that there's a competitive market so that SpaceX is not the only company that is providing launch. And that's critically important to our nation, because all it takes is, one or two failures and you realize, oh, I've got a problem. I need to go to a different launch vehicle. That's where we found ourselves in the 80s when we had the Challenger accident, and we lost the ability to be able to launch big satellites into space for a long period of time. We can't afford to be there again. And so keeping that competitive environment has been something that the NSSL has done very, very well. At the same time, to Damon's point, launch is now becoming a commodity, right? And launches are frequent enough, and they're going to become more frequent. Whether that's going to be done by the Blue Origin, whether that's by ULA, whether it's by SpaceX, or whether it's by some of these emerging companies that will be able to do kinds of smaller launches, but more frequent launches. That is going to allow the Space Force to be able to kind of buy when needed, as opposed to necessarily buying 2 years in advance. But that's where we are today, is 2 years in advance. So this budget of buying 9 NSSL launches is for launches in 2029.
Perfect. Let's talk about new mission sets. And I had a conversation with General Miller recently on a podcast where he's talking about GMTI, ground moving target indicator, and AMTI, air moving target indicator, now moving some of those mission sets to space, which again goes to the point about, as technological capability increases, where can we save resources in other domains, because we now have this new warfighting domain that is providing capability and access unlike anything we've ever seen before. So Shawn, for you've commanded at the squadron group level. You understand what it means to stand up a new mission set operationally. The Space Force is now being asked to absorb AMTI at about $7 billion in new funding for a mission that has historically belonged to airborne platforms. Is the service organizationally and culturally ready for this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's going to be up to both the Air Force and the Space Force to be able to get this right, because AMTI, Air Moving Target Indicator, is but one thing that happens in an AWACS plane today. The rest of it is air battle management, right? Because it's actually like talking to our fighter pilots and our mobility pilots about where to go, what the threats are that are out there. It's not just about showing a picture. It's more than that. I think the space part of this is going to be the sensing part, but not the battle management directly itself. We are still going to need air battle managers within the U.S. Air Force using space-derived data into that. So I think culturally we'll be fine with that aspect. I think the Air Force is more and more accepting of space-derived data. I think that particularly younger people today are not concerned about where the data comes from as much as, is that data available to me? Is it accurate? Is it assured? Can I count on it? But I think the air battle management needs to be done by airmen. I don't think that's a guardian role to do air battle management. GMTI is a little bit different because it's not so much about managing ground activities as it was about sensing and then providing that to others that are going to then go prosecute targets.
Thank you. Damon, any comments on that?
Yeah, so I would push back just a touch in one area. I agree with you completely, Shawn, that air battle management should be done by airmen. But I don't want that to be translated as the Space Force doesn't have a battle management role. I've long advocated from the first time I saw the OPIR Battle Space Awareness Center, the OBAC, up at Buckley. The first time I walked in that room and saw what they were doing, I was like, this is battle management. This is not intel. And we should be leaning, we, the Space Force, because I was still serving at the time, we, the Air Force Space Command, should be leaning into this and developing battle managers in the same way, similar to how the Air Force does air battle management, in the same way that the Army puts ground commanders and ground experts on JSTARS to help facilitate the ground campaign or the air campaign. But I believe there's a place in the future architecture where the Guardian is just as much of a battle manager as perhaps a airman or a soldier. And I'll point out that it is interesting we've had this tension for many years about, well, space is coming. Space can replace AWACS. Space can replace these airborne platforms. These airborne platforms do have to operate in a permissive environment, so I'm not dismissing the challenges of operating an airborne platform. But I am a person who prefers having a couple of different modalities to provide such a critical service. So I think there's probably a place where you can have an airborne layer as well as a space layer. Maybe the space layer is the dominant piece and you augment with the air side. Last piece I'll say is, if people might have missed it in the news, but we did lose an AWACS over in the Persian Gulf. That it was on the ramp and it got hit by an Iranian, I think it was a drone, but we've lost a already small fleet number of aircraft. We've lost one last week. So we do have to have a solution for AMTI, and I think space is going to be a great contributor to that.
Yeah, Damon, I appreciate the distinction you made there, because I think you're spot on, right? Guardians absolutely are going to be involved in battle management. We're going to need to have space battle managers out the wazoo, right? I mean, it's going to be critically important. And towards your earlier question about the classified budget, right? If we're going to have an arsenal of capability that are both offensive and defensive in nature, somebody has to be able to manage that fight. And we're going to need space battle managers to do that. And you certainly want space smart people to understand how to best use that data into the air battle management, into the ground battle management pieces.
Yeah.
Which is why the Army still maintains FA-40s, right? Because They want people that understand Army business and space business.
Great conversation, gentlemen. Damon, you oversaw 17,000 personnel as a numbered Air Force vice commander. This budget shows a 250% increase in education and training. Is that sufficient to grow the Guardian Force into these new missions, or is the capability outrunning the people?
I would say there's a pretty good chance the capabilities outrunning the people. I believe that this growth here, this 250% increase, is probably a down payment, because the Space Force and its predecessor, Air Force Space Command, has been talking about realistic training for a long, long time. We are beyond it being a good idea. It is a requirement with our adversary capabilities out there that are demonstrable and we know exist. We talk about them in the open. When you have that, when you have activities like we are seeing in Iraq right now, we saw in Venezuela, we saw in Midnight Hammer last year, we have to be able to train in a realistic setting in the same way that soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen train. So having a realistic training environment, critical, absolutely critical. And that realistic, and that training environment has to be supported left of with test and train, test infrastructure, test ranges, et cetera. So I believe that long term, this is probably going to be seen as a down payment. I also see that this is an opportunity for the Space Force, not only with its training increase, but also with potentially its manpower increase, to perhaps explore diversifying its political equity across the United States. The manpower and dollars of the Space Force tend to be centralized in Colorado, Southern California, the Space Coast of Florida, and DC. Those are kind of the centers of gravity. I would hope that as this money is appropriated and becomes real, that the Space Force takes an opportunity to consider maybe putting it in places where it is able to connect with the American population more than it does today.
Yeah, and just huge thanks to the SFA chapters out there that are engaging at the local level. You were a chapter president here at SFA down in Huntsville, and you're still active there at that chapter. Shawn, you're the vice president of the DC chapter, still active there, helping to get the word out to the American public about how critical the Space Force is. So let's talk just collectively, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And now the GMTI and AMTI and what they support ground, air, naval forces directly. Is the Joint Force prepared to integrate space capabilities at scale into the joint fight? And is it the Space Force's job to make sure they are?
So it is certainly the Space Force's job, just like any other service, to organize, train, and equip the capabilities for the warfighter. In this case, on the space side, that's primarily U.S. Space Command. But it is also ensuring that the other combatant commands understand, appreciate, and can take full advantage of what the space capabilities of the Space Force, which is why you're seeing Space Force PACOM, Space Force UCOM, Space Force, name the other combatant command besides U.S. Space Command that is being supported. All of those things are going to be important moving forward. And again, if I hearken back just to, the ongoing conflict right now, on day one, the chairman talked about the value of space to that fight. I think every warfighter out there knows in the back of their head that they're depending on space. They may not fully appreciate how, but they know that they are depending on it. And it's great to see the Space Force being recognized for that, not so much so they can beat their chest, but so that they can continue to advocate for the sorts of resources that are going to be required.
Damon, any comments?
I do. The Space Force got a little bit of pushback when it started putting out the service components to the other combat commands. And General Saltzman was completely correct in this, that services, one of the things that a service does is it presents forces to the other combatant commanders for the purposes of integrating their domain into that particular combatant commander's campaign. And consistent with joint doctrine, the service with the preponderance of forces and the ability to conduct joint command and control typically leads that domain's fraction of the campaign in that combatant commander's AOR. So the fact that we have Space Forces INDOPACOM, Space Forces Southcom, Space Forces EUCOM, Space Forces CENT, et cetera, that is a great maturation of the Space Forces capability, and it's demonstrating to the joint force that Space Force is here, and Space Force is leaning into not just being a blanket service provider, but providing tailored effects for a given moment in time. We've had some of that capability in small slivers throughout the years. I would offer that, going back to some questions you had earlier about Space Development Agency, their architecture is intended to be highly tailorable for specific moments in time in a campaign. Something that the Space Force really has not done at the scale that is capable inside of Space Development Agency's architecture. Now, when it comes to things like the SATCOM pieces that Systems Command is looking at with MILNET/Space Data Network, you'll see some of those pieces and parts, but we will soon get to a point, I believe, where as the Space Force, the services, the combatant commands get more and more used to seeing guardians in their op center and asking the critical questions and delivering results, that you're going to see an uptick in demand for space experts in the theater, helping them build their campaigns and ensuring that the Joint Force Commander meets their objectives.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a conversation with Colonel Alford, Space Forces South Commander, recently, and he was talking about the need, because right now, we just talked about the Space Force components that are in the respective combatant commanders' areas of responsibility. The fact is they're sitting in an air operations center. The question now that we have to start thinking about is it time, and this is what Colonel Alford had said, is we got to start thinking about space operations centers. They're in theater so that we can do that deliberate planning to synchronize effects that makes sense to that combatant command to ensure space superiority at a time and place of their choosing.
Bill, you and I both were planners in AOCs. Shawn, I'm not sure if you were or not, but I worked in the strategy plans division and occasionally would do a little bit of stuff on the combat ops floor. But really, the space guys in an AOC kind of had their own ops center, and it was called the SAP-F. Because you'd go to the ops floor and you'd work for a little bit, and then you'd leave your NCO in charge while you run back to the SCIF and into the SAP-F and do the real mission planning.
Yeah.
And then you'd come back out and, Chief Combat Ops, hey, what'd you do? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't tell you.
That's right.
But you're going to love
it. Trust us. Remember the trust me card we'd play with the air component? Hey, trust us. We're going to deliver effects. And they'd say, no, get out. Hey, space guy, go away until you actually deliver the capability.
Yeah. So I mean, we've had it for a while. Like I said, I was being a little bit silly here, but truthful, that the Space Ops Center was kind of really the SAP-F, because your STO chief at the AOC, Chancellor, that was a space person. The deputy STO chief, Chancellor, that was another space person. And that's where the bulk of like the high end planning was going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're spot on. And it's unfortunate, but true. And the unfortunate part of it is you can't tell at a secret environment exactly all the planning that's going on, in the SAP-F. And that's frustrating to folks who don't have those tickets. Now, I know the service is working on declassifying capabilities or bringing out into the open capabilities that have been in the past previously classified. So that's a big step forward that I think is going to help with some of this budget discussion. So let's pivot a little bit to congressional engagement, because we know really a majority of this is going to be educating congressional staffers and PSMs and saying, hey, this is why this is so important. So Shawn, you spent years as the DAF's primary voice to the appropriations and budget committees. If you're still in that role, what would your strategy be for moving this request through Congress? What's the sequencing? Who are the key members? And what's the argument that works?
Yeah. So first of all, I would applaud the entire Department of War and certainly General Saltzman for signaling several months ago that the Space Force budget is likely to be significantly larger. He has made those comments, and it's very common that they're not allowed to be able to signal that there's significant changes coming. That's really important because you don't want Congress to find out about something for the first time when those budget documents go over. Frankly, surprise is kind of like your worst enemy on that. And so I'm glad to see that he's had the chance to be able to sort of set the table for what is now going to be a set of specifics that are going to have to be solved. The key folks on this are going to be within the appropriations committees. There are very highly qualified, but just a few professional staff members on the HAC-D and the SAC-D. So the House Appropriations Committee on Defense, the Senate Appropriations Committee on Defense, that focus on space. And convincing them of what we're trying to do is step one. Convincing the chairman or chairwoman of those committees is kind of step two. Getting the rest of the folks on the committee or subcommittee in this case to be comfortable with what's in there is going to be step three. And the appropriators really are going to kind of run that. Outside of the appropriators, which isn't a huge number of people, there's not a lot of folks that get a strong voice in what actually goes out in the budget. Now, in parallel to that, you do want the folks that are putting together the National Defense Authorization Act, the policy people, the HASC and the SASC. You do want them to understand what's in the budget so that they can authorize that activity. That typically is not as hard of a sell as it is on the appropriation side, but it's vitally important to have those looking at the budget in a similar fashion and both fundamentally approving. But in the end, it's the appropriators that will appropriate the budget.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. You're working with the DC chapter on creating some events around helping to get the word out and helping to educate folks about how critical the Space Force is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. SFA at the national level plus through the DC chapter, and in cooperation with members of the Space Force Legislative Affairs team, we've collaborated to put together a Capitol Hill series of events. The first one will be later this month, and the topic is growing the force. So the way this is envisioned to go down is we will have some time with House staffers and members, spend some time talking about what the justification is for growing the force, and then later do the same thing with the Senate side of the Hill. And so 2 sessions on a given day. And then as the summer months come on, we've got a couple more of those in the pipeline. Again, working with cooperating with Space Force Legislative Affairs to ensure we've got a good topic to bring to the members so that they do get a deeper understanding of what this budget is really asking for, because it is pretty easy to get wrapped up in the numbers and to get wrapped up into things that went good or bad in a prior budget year for a service. And this is an opportunity for the Space Force to spend some good time just building the necessary conversations on the Hill.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind. We talked a little bit about scale before, and Damon, mentioned sort of the size differences between the Space Force and the other services. And from a budget standpoint, the Space Force is moving from about 3% of the defense budget to about 4.7% of the defense budget. So it's still not a huge portion of the defense budget, but it's a growing and critical portion.
Yeah, and as you wrote in your op-ed, Shawn, that adversaries would like nothing more than for Congress to focus on other priorities. You've been in those rooms. What do you say to a member of Congress who is supportive of defense broadly, but skeptical about the scale of this particular request?
Yeah, so I would start again with what it is that space does for the warfighter, what it is that space does for the average American, what it is that space is going to be doing for the economy. And then that be a basis. If you want to convince a member of the goodness of something, explain to them how it affects their district, the people that live in their district, the workforce that's in their district, the economy of their district or state. That's how you motivate a member to take action one way or the other. And so doing that. Damon's point, I think, was excellent about sort of creating greater political wherewithal, so that we're not in condensed spots like Colorado Springs, like Florida, like DC, and growing in Huntsville, Alabama. It needs to be broader than that.
Yeah, Damon, any comments?
Yeah, I've had the good fortune over the past couple of months of doing a lot of public speaking about the Space Force with my role as the CEO. And I typically start the conversation not from a military point of view, but I start from the economics of space. That the space economy for liberal democracies is gigantic. That space is so interwoven into our daily lives that you just miss it if you aren't careful. And so you think day in and day out you might have some economic tribulations. Just wait until if space were to go away, just how bad things would get. So you start from that and you show the trajectory of where space is going. This $1.8 trillion economy vision out there, and the majority of that growth, about 2/3, if I remember the numbers correctly, are in the commercial side. It's not on the infrastructure. It's not launching satellites and rockets and stuff like that. So for a community that may not have an aerospace and defense industry, it doesn't matter. They're the places that are going to get the bulk of the growth. And so by showing that to me, that opens the door. Then the second thing that I do, and if I were a member of Congress, or if I were able to affect a member of Congress, we do it, but I would do it as much as we could. When you tell the story of how GPS works, and it's a bunch of young folks who are in their 20s running GPS for the world, or you take them up to Buckley and put them on the outfloor and show them that the nation's missile warning is run by young folks. And General Gagnon did a magnificent job of telling the story about the young captain who was working at IUD when a massive missile raid came over from Iran. Those stories help people really kind of grasp the human side of what's going on. Is that, we got this great technology, but in the middle of it and at the real point of execution, it's a person, and we need to do all that we can to make sure that person is successful and that they're able to come home.
Yeah, perfect. All right. As we close out this episode of the Spacepower Podcast, let's ask the Spacepower question. Same question to both of you. What does Spacepower mean? Not as a budget number, not as a capability list, but as something that has to be felt and understood by every American, every joint warfighter who depends on it, and every member of Congress who votes on it. Shawn, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So, like air power, space power is not a single thing. Like air power, that is mobility and fighter aircraft and refueling and ISR, space is a variety of things. And it's the totality of what moves forward that is space power. But more importantly, you have to have space power in today's day and age if the United States is going to remain the preeminent nation throughout as far as the eye can see. Absent that, we will not be the global power that we are today. And space power is a foundational aspect of that.
Thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, the Space Force hits the nail on the head in their core doctrine, document 1. And it says, space power is the totality of a nation's ability to exploit the space domain in pursuit of prosperity. It starts with prosperity, to pursue prosperity and security. So that is such a great statement from the service as to why it exists and why it pursues space power, because they see themselves as an instrument of a broader enterprise that is made up with civil, commercial, and government components. But yeah, to me, that's what space power is all about.
Perfect. Shawn, Damon, I want to be direct about what just happened here. We had the person who spent years walking space budgets to Capitol Hill on behalf of the Department of the Air Force, and the person who helped build Space Force budget structure from inside the Pentagon. both in the same conversation about the most significant Space Force budget request since the service was founded. That's not a conversation you get very often, and I'm grateful for both of you for taking time and spending time talking about this most important topic.
Yeah, it's been great, and I want to thank Shawn, because I know that you were traveling over the weekend and this week. So to be able to get us together to talk about this is a great accomplishment. Space technology is allowing us to do this right now. I'm teasing a little bit here, but I think you get the point. This has been a fantastic conversation, because it's so impactful to this mission that we love.
Well, and I very much appreciate it. I'm passionate about it. I know the two of you are passionate about it, and it's a growing passion that's out there. Whether it's the NASA Artemis program that has gotten people excited, right? Like that little kid on CNN, whether it's that, or whether it's just your average Joe on the street. I think people are getting more and more fascinated about space again. That's a good thing. And I think there's a growing appreciation for the importance of space in today's conflict, and they recognize that has got to be there moving forward. And so, thanks again for the opportunity to be able to talk about it.